Teach and Learns or the away day that's being planned for Newcastle in October. I'll be in touch with you all kind of shortly about that if you need kind of travel coverage and logistics for that as well. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you there. Right, I'm going to hand over to Sarah now, who's going to introduce herself and lead you today in an overview of kind of developer contributions, and then time at the end of her presentation for lots of questions. I'm going to have to dial off today because I've got a event in-person workshop that I'm going to be running in the next 10 minutes. So it's lovely to see you all. See you all again soon. Any issues, just drop me a line, and over to you, Sarah.
Thank you, Shelley, and a very warm welcome to you all this morning. I've been so excited to come in and talk to you about developer contributions and delivering infrastructure. As Shelley said, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end, but given we're such a small group, if there are things as we go through the presentation that you think you'd like to expand on, or you've got any questions about, if something just doesn't make sense, actually just put your hand up, or you could just put your mic on and just ask that question, as we are a small group. So let's take advantage of that. So I'm a chartered town planner. I've been a planner for about just over 20 years now, and I've done a lot of work across councils, primarily in London in the first part of my career, but more latterly across the country. And as Shelley said, I've just joined her as part of the planning advisory service team at a really exciting time, because there's lots of government reforms. Have some of you all heard about some of those government reforms? You can show your hands or use the chat function. Yeah, Ella, kind of it, yeah. So it's in the news a lot at the moment, and so lots going on in the planning space. So let's make a start. But first of all, when I said developer contributions, does anyone know what that is? Has anyone heard of that before? Again, just show of hands. I'm not seeing any hands. So one, Alice. So you've had some experience with developer contributions, section 106 and so. So I've assumed that you don't know too much going into this session. So Alice, some of the elements might be a bit too introductory for you, but hopefully just a useful recap on some of the things that you do know. So again, feel free to unmute or use your chat function if you prefer. But just starting with this slide, what do you think some of what we're going to talk about today is? There's a huge clue on the screen. It's not music. What are all of these about? What's the common theme in some of these songs, if you can see those images on the screen? Give you a moment. Money. Thank you, Alice. Money. Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of what we're going to talk about is the money side of development today. I think it's a hugely interesting area of planning work. So I've got my Jessie J reference in there so I can move on. But what we're going to cover in detail is some of the main uses of developer contributions. These are contributions to from developers to mitigate the impacts of their development. Normally infrastructure impacts, so things like highways or impacts on schools, that kind of thing, but also importantly to secure affordable housing. And when we talk about affordable housing, that's quite an expensive component of the total kind of development value. So talk about unpick some of those main uses of developer contributions. I'm going to introduce you to something called an infrastructure delivery plan, or IDP for short. Are you guys getting used to the you're getting used to the sort of number of acronyms in planning? They're endless, aren't they? And so many abbreviations for yes, that might be it. Yes, yeah, definitely. You'll find loads of them, and they exhaust me as well. And I've been doing this for a long time, and new ones are popping up all the time. But if you hear about an IDP in a planning context, it's often talking about an infrastructure delivery plan. And then we're going to return to some of the kind of detailed mechanisms for securing developer contributions, some of the legal stuff that goes on behind that. And then we're going to talk about viability. Again, when I say viability, has anyone come across that in a planning context? Again, just a show of hands. Right. Okay. Grand. Okay, so some understanding again. do feel free to add any thoughts that you have if you have come across some of these concepts, or indeed ask questions if you haven't. Okay, so let's talk about affordable housing. I think we've got a general sense of what affordability means anyway. But affordable housing, there's a definition here, and this is taken from National Planning Policy, which is, as I say, currently the subject of reform at the moment. But affordable housing is not normal market housing, so it's not like going to buy a house just on the open market. It's different types of products that make buying that home or renting that home more affordable. So there's some level of subsidy involved. And so you will have perhaps come across concepts already, such as shared ownership or low cost sort of market sales housing or social rented housing. So a lot of housing by registered providers, even by that social landlords, are social rented homes. So there's a definition, as I say, in national policy, but planning is a really important way in which we secure affordable homes in this country. And I'll come back to that, but I'll just let you have a look at this definition here. Are you recognising some of those products? Have you heard of shared ownership, for example? Come across that? Yeah, okay. So affordable housing is, when we're talking about developer contributions, contributions from developers, affordable housing is a significant component of that. So let's look at an affordable housing policy. Have you had any training related to local plans yet? Were you using local plans already if you started your placement? Yeah, exactly. So you'll recognise this as a policy from a local plan document. This particular local plan is, I think this is Barnsley. Yeah, Barnsley, it says it on the top there. So this local plan for Barnsley is saying what the council there expects developers to deliver in terms of their affordable housing requirements. And this particular policy is saying, look, if you're going to develop a residential development of 15 or more homes, we're going to expect you to provide affordable housing on site. And they are asking for 30% in some locations, as you can see in that second paragraph, and 20% in others, and it goes down to 10%. Why do you think there might be that variance? Any thoughts? You can use the chat if you'd like to. Why might you ask for 30% in some places, 20% and 10 in others? Any thoughts? Yeah, that's a really good one, Ella. So dependent on identified needs. So you might have done a survey to look at the different needs in an area, and there might be particular localized needs. Any other thoughts? Well, it really goes back to our first slide. It's kind of goes back to the money side of things, because the amount of affordable housing, or indeed anything we ask for from a local plan, national planning policy says, well, there has to be viable, it has to be affordable for the developer to deliver it, because if it isn't, you won't get that development. And so here we can see that they varied, and I'll come back to viability, but they varied the amount they asked for. It could be in part related to identified need, and I've certainly seen that in some local plans, Ella, but it can also be because of the affordability in different locations. Maybe land prices are a bit higher, it's a bit more expensive to develop in a specific area. There might be significant land contamination issues or something that makes development more expensive, and that hence we have this variation in the amount of affordable housing that they've asked for. And we can see that here in this, you see my cursor? Someone give me a nod so I can, perhaps you're not seeing it there. Okay, oh, you are, brilliant. Okay, so just in this here, we can say these percentages will be sought unless it can be demonstrated through a viability assessment that the required figure would render the scheme unviable. That's a rather long-winded way of saying if it's not affordable for the developer, we might look at varying the amount that we'll ask for, and we'll return to this issue of viability later. So developer contributions, one of the primary uses is to secure affordable housing. We see that in a local plan. And if you open any local plan, you'll see a policy that looks something like this in relation to the amount of affordable housing being asked for. For those of you who are at authorities already, open your local plan and find your policy that relates to affordable housing. It's going to be in there. Okay, so what a local plan will also do is set out the authorities' expectations in terms of other issues beyond just affordable housing. So what are those other issues that a development might need to sort of mitigate? And here we talk about, when I'm talking about mitigation, a development has impacts, doesn't it? A development, the new occupiers of a development, they're going to use services in that area. They're going to use utilities, infrastructure, they're going to use schools, they're going to use all of these things. And so in the planning space, we start to think about, well, is there enough of that infrastructure to support a particular development? And in the case of individual developments, do we need a particular contribution towards a type of infrastructure, such as a school, such as highways or roadworks linked to a development or linked to the overall development within an area? And so this is what this policy is doing. It's reminding developers who want to develop in this area that we're going to be asking you as a council for contributions towards not just affordable housing, which we've talked about now, but also wider infrastructure, those wider infrastructure impacts of your development. Okay, and so sitting underneath that sort of plan policy that we just saw there, so we're saying we need all this type, this, we might need your contributions to the infrastructure. A local plan will also have a number of evidence documents that sit underneath it, looking at all kinds of things. So maybe looking at the particular habitat impacts. So what are those, some of those natural environmental impacts of a plan. They'll have things like a sustainability appraisal, like say looking at those plan policies, what are the social, environmental or economic impacts. But most local plans will also have, as part of that wide evidence base that is used to prepare them, have something called an infrastructure delivery plan. I've put a hyperlink to an example in here from Wandsworth, but again, if you Google your own authority, either that you're living in or if you've started your placement and Google infrastructure delivery plan, you'll probably turn up, at least if not a current version, an older version of an infrastructure delivery plan. But I've put a link in again so you can have a look at what these look like. And what these documents are doing are they're thinking, okay, we're planning for all this growth in a local plan. So we're wanting, I don't know, 8,000 new homes in this location, maybe a further 10,000 down the line a little bit, spread throughout the authority. There might be some new commercial interventions going on, so we might want some renewal of a industrial park, for example. There might be new logistics operations that you're expecting. And then so what we're doing through these infrastructure delivery plans is we're saying, taking account of all of this growth, what's the infrastructure that we need to support it? Because development doesn't just happen, well, unfortunately it does actually, in the sense that sometimes if that infrastructure is not there at the right time and in the right place. So if you're building a new community, a new residential neighbourhood, for example, it's not just the houses, is it? Of course, it's like the schools. Is there a local shop? How are people going to access the services they need? Is there a GP that's near enough? And if there is there space in that GP for those new residents to access services? And so an infrastructure delivery plan is a kind of framework for thinking about the impacts of a development that a particular local authority is planning. So I used infrastructure quite broadly there, but just to unpack that a little bit more, when you open one of these IDP documents, or when we're talking about infrastructure in the context of developer contributions, these are some of the range of things that we might be thinking about. I'll just caution on utilities. We wouldn't typically be seeking a contribution for developers for those utilities. It's more about understanding if the capacity in the utilities infrastructure, so your energy infrastructure, your water infrastructure, is there to support the development. There are separate mechanisms, separate financial mechanisms and processes that relate outside of planning to developers accessing utilities services. But across some of these other issues, we might be very directly asking a developer, well, actually, we need a contribution. We need a school on site if it's a very large development, or we need a contribution to expanding a school or delivering a community facility or new playing pitch provision or open space or whatever it might be. And so we're thinking about infrastructure in this strategic way through this infrastructure delivery plan. So what's our overall growth, or where are those bigger sites, and what do we need in terms of these different infrastructure types to support development? And then we'll be thinking about it in the context of an individual development, perhaps. Okay, what's the specific impact of a individual development when it comes in as a planning application across these different dimensions? And when is it appropriate to ask for a contribution from a developer because their development is having an impact? Is everyone with me so far? Good, thank you, Alice. That's reassuring. Grant. Right, let's move on. So if we're looking at this infrastructure delivery plan, what we're normally doing is we're saying, okay, what's a likely population change? And going back to a really great point you made earlier, Ella, what are the needs of the population? So, for example, if the population is getting a bit older, they might need certain types of infrastructure provision. So we talked about it before in the context of housing provision. You might need homes that are more suitable for older people. But when we're thinking about infrastructure, if you've got an aging population, that has implications for things like health services, that kind of provision. Or if you've got a younger population, that will have implications for things like school provision, nursery provision, early years type provision. So the actual shape, if you like, of that population, that demography, is going to impact on the type of infrastructure needed. There'll also be different locations of planned development. I can see, are some of you working in London? Perhaps you could let me know in the chat where you're working. See one thumbs up for London. You see RBKC there. Is anyone working elsewhere in the country? St Helens. Okay, great. In the north. Right. Okay, northwest. Okay, so there'll be different patterns, if you like, of development in different locations. So in London, you often have quite a bit of development everywhere. But if you're in a more rural part of the country, you might have development centred on your larger market towns and then some isolated development separated by areas of countryside. So it's a more dispersed pattern of development. But that location of new development is really important when we're thinking about what's the new infrastructure needed. Because if we're in a less urban area, for example, there might not be access in close enough travel distances to facilities. So if we've got a new very large scale development, is there a school provision close enough to that development? Do we need to look at that? How will people access those facilities? Or in a London context, what are the, if you've got particular more dispersed pattern of development, there might be pressure that's more uniform across the area. So thinking about the implications of that development for infrastructure provision is really important. So we're looking at, okay, what's the demand? So what's that population demand? And we're thinking about it in the context of the different types of infrastructure. So if I flip back to this slide, for each of these different infrastructure types, we're then thinking about, okay, what have we got already? We might have lots of schools. So for example, in London at the moment, there's a lot of provision of primary schools and they've got quite a lot of capacity in it. That's not all the way across London. There are some pockets still of quite high demand, but particularly in more central areas of London, what they're actually finding is there is actually quite a lot of capacity in schools. And so why am I drawing this out? It means that if a development's coming in, and it's going to have some new occupants and new so children in that development will need to access schools just because they need to access schools, it doesn't automatically mean that you need a school. You might have loads of capacity in your school already, or you might have capacity, but is that school in the right place? So there are all of those things to work through. Simon, that is not a silly question at all. If you could look in the chat, the question there is the demography of a population typically identified through major surveys or other research to consider whether it would be better to build more schools or community or adult services? So there are a number of sources, and welcome to the session. I'm just inviting another colleague in. So I'll just pause there. I'll just I'll come back to that question, Simon, but for those who've just joined, my name's Sarah. I work with Shelley, and we're talking today about developer contributions. Welcome to the session. We just talked about affordable housing and infrastructure, and now we're thinking about when we're planning for growth within an area, planning for new homes, etc. How are we assessing what we need in terms of services? And the questions, the sorts of sources we might be drawing on is we'll be looking at things like census data. So when I talked about the ages of the population, is the population young? Is it getting older? How is that changing over time? I might be considering census data. There might also be other survey data that I commission specifically to understand some of these things better. But I'm also going to be talking to the different infrastructure providers in the context of an infrastructure delivery plan to understand that. So I'm going to be going to colleagues either within my authority, if I'm in a unitary authority, or within the county, if I'm in a two-tier authority area, to understand what their plans are for school provision, what analysis that they have done. So we're drawing all of these things together. I hope that answers your question, at least in part, but we can certainly come back to that as we'll have time for further discussion at the end. So we're doing this infrastructure delivery plan. Where have we got to? Right, we've thought about, okay, what level of demand do we have, but what have we already got? What's under pressure? Have we got room in schools, or are they kind of at bursting point? What's our level of park provision like? And so we're thinking about all these different infrastructure types. And just to flip back there to our colleague who's just joined us, when we're talking about infrastructure, we're talking about transport, education, health and adult services, so GP provision, for example, and this whole range of different infrastructure types. So we've got this, all right, what's the need, what we've got, and we're kind of doing the maths on that. So taking into account need, is there enough supply? But it's not such a simple calculation, because as I was alluding to, you might have an overall level of demand and you might have an overall level of supply, but is that supply of infrastructure, if it's a school, let's stick with a school example, is it in the right place for your development? Is it even at the right time for your development? Because you might have a very large development which has a really long build-out period, which means that the demand for school doesn't come for the first 10 years of the development, if that makes sense. And so we're drawing all of these together when we're thinking about how we're planning for infrastructure delivery, when we're looking at the local plan scale rather than the application scale, but I'll come to the individual development scale in a minute. And so normally the culmination of this exercise, what do we need based on all of that analysis? What have we got? Sort of adding or subtracting, depending on how you look at that. What does that therefore mean? We start to identify a series of different infrastructure projects. And usually if you look at the example of the infrastructure delivery plan I gave you, as I said, if you just Google your area and then infrastructure delivery plan, you'll probably find a document like this. You'll have a series of projects listed. It might say a school in this location. This is how much it's going to cost. This is who's going to deliver it in terms of the body responsible for it. This is how important it is to the delivery of our plan, and there might be some risks, and that might be for transport. It could be a new station, could be a new junction, sort of highways type development, but it will have a whole schedule of things that we're saying that we need these different types of infrastructure to support the development that we're planning for. So that's an IDP. So we've talked about a local plan which will set out this is the amount of affordable housing that we want, the percentage. If you're building residential development in our area, we'll normally have a policy in our council saying this is how much affordable housing we expect. We'll normally have a policy saying we expect you to provide some infrastructure to support, to mitigate the impacts of your development on schools, on health services, on open spaces, this kind of thing. And we'll say that in our local plan as well. And to understand that need, we'll usually go through the sort of process I'm just describing, which is this infrastructure delivery plan. And just to wrap up on that, we talked about this kind of desktop analysis and modelling of demand, that pulling together that demographic, that need data. Importantly, there's dialogue with providers. So I'm a planner, but I'm going to be talking to energy providers to understand, is there capacity in the network? So if I'm putting 20,000 new homes in there, is the energy network going to fall over? Is there sufficient water supply? So one of the big issues, for example, at the moment in Cambridgeshire is water water supply issues and a lack of clarity over that, and that's holding up some of the sort of decisions around how much growth they can have. So that's just one example. But we'd be talking to all of these different sort of infrastructure providers. If you're in London, you'd be talking to colleagues at TfL, transport provider, to say, well, this is what we think in terms of growth in our local plan. Can the system support it? If it can't support it, what do we need to do in terms of new projects? And this infrastructure delivery plan process, it's sort of an ongoing process. It's normally done to sit underneath the plan. So when you're preparing a local plan for an area, but the idea is that you normally just keep updating that because things change, don't they? We've heard, like you might have heard, that some big transport projects were cancelled, for example, and then that might have an impact and you might need to go back and reassess that demand. Or we've talked about schools, for example. It's not just that development, the new development that's affecting that, it's the existing development and birth rates, for example. So if birth rates suddenly go up, those sorts of demographic changes, that might impact our assessment of infrastructure demand. So this is really an ongoing process that we use to inform our plan making, but also to just keep understanding what's happening in our particular context. So I think it's a really interesting area of work. Rockiana, I think, who's just joined us, please feel free to ask questions as we go along. I'll be using the chat, or you can unmic as we go along, but there will be, as I said before, time for questions at the end. So let's talk now about Section 106. So the title of this presentation is Developer Contributions, and a type of developer contributions, a planning mechanism or tool for securing developer contributions, is Section 106. And so this is a description, and again, you can take away these slides and we're recording the session as I'll move over it. But Section 106 agreement allows you to secure planning obligations. These are obligations on a developer or other parties to do things in connection with a development. And then that might do things like restrict the use of demand of the land, rather. So that could be saying, okay, you can't have car parking. We might be right in a central area of London. We're trying to minimise climate impact. We want to reduce private car travel. You can't have car parking. Or you might need to use a certain amount of the homes within your development as affordable housing. We just talked about that. Might be highways works. There might be other financial contributions, so contribution towards a community centre, for example. So that is Section 106. And it's called Section 106 after the part of the Planning Act that it's secured under. That's the legal sort of hook that Section 106 sits under. But you'll also hear it described as a planning obligation. So planning obligations are secured through Section 106 under Section 106 of this Planning Act. And so you'll sometimes hear it abbreviated to S106, Section 106. But these are planning obligations and the types of developer contributions. We'll come back to that at the end if you'd like to, if it's a bit of a newer area for you. So there are rules about how we use planning obligations. So we can't just ask a developer for everything or anything. So I might, for example, know that there's a very high birth rate in the area that I plan for, let's say, and there's quite a lot of demand on, let's say, nursery places. Now, what these rules for the way we use planning obligations do is say that might be true that there's lots of demand for nursery places because there's high birth rates in your existing population, but a developer can only be expected to mitigate the impacts of their development, not that existing demand, if you like. So while the development, like so if maybe someone's wants to put in 200 or 2,000 or 4,000 homes, what we're looking at is what is the impact of that specific development, not the overall demand, because it wouldn't be fair, of course, to ask a developer to pay for all of that existing demand, which has nothing to do with the development. It's just paying for the kind of additional impact of their development. And the law, planning law, sort of sets out these rules for how we can use planning obligations. And so it says it must be necessary to that specific development. As I was just alluding to, it must be directly related to that development. There can't be a need elsewhere, or we just need a library. That's nice for as a council, but that's not relevant unless it's relating to the impact of the development. And it must also be fairly and reasonably related in scale and kind to that development. So if someone's putting in a small shop, let's say, it wouldn't be reasonable for me to ask them to provide a secondary school, would it? Because how would that relate to the impact of a shop? First of all, that seems hugely disproportionate in terms of costs, but also what's the impact of that school if we were looking at of that shop on a school? So I hope that made sense as an example. Again, we can come back to it. But what these rules are about is saying like that are set out in law, as I say, and I'll get a link to the law in there if you want to have a look at where these are set out. It's saying this needs to be a fair process and it needs to be proportionate in terms of what you're asking for. Importantly, with section 106, a type of planning obligation, it's negotiable. So that means it's not a fixed charge. There's a bit of to and fro between the council and the developer, and it has to be agreed between the council and the developer in the context of a planning application and a separate section 106 agreement that goes with it. So here is an example of a section 106 template. This one's for Birmingham. What does this look like to you? Any thoughts you put in the chat? What does that look like to you when you saw that? Not a trick question. Does that remind you of anything? Right, it's a contract. Spot on, Ella. So essentially what it is, we talked about it being negotiable. It's a contract. It's a legal document. So much like your agreement with your mobile phone provider, or if if you're renting and you've got a lease with your landlord, it's an agreement between the developer and the council. And it's an agreement setting out what have you agreed in terms of the planning obligations that are being secured. So we're saying, oh, you need to pay X amount of money, or you need to deliver this number of homes as affordable housing as part of this development. And we're putting it in a contract, a section 106 agreement, contractual agreement, to make sure that it happens. I talked about it being negotiable, and this contract is negotiable, and it's usually if you're a planning officer in development management, along with your colleagues in your legal team in a council, you'll be negotiating this with the developer or the planning consultant for that developer, and indeed their own legal representatives. The main heads for very big developments, they'll often be reported to a planning committee, and there'll be a committee report you will have seen. Perhaps some of those, or you certainly will do when you start in, for those of you who haven't started their placements yet. But they'll have the main obligations set out in that kind of committee report, oftentimes for councillors to agree. So this much affordable housing, or this much money to a major junction. That's for those largest or more complex developments, or it might be signed off by a more senior officer who has authority delegated from those councillors to allow them to do that. And so that contract is essentially drawn up, and a section 106 agreement is made. And the section 106 agreement is that contract type document. Sometimes something called a unilateral undertaking is used. You'll hear when you're discussing section 106, unilateral undertaking. And that's different to section 106. Has anyone come across a unilateral undertaking? Show of hands? No? Okay. What do you think the difference might be? Again, not a trick question, between a section 106 agreement and a unilateral undertaking. What might the difference be? Any thoughts? No? Right. So the clue's kind of in the title here, unilateral, one person. So rather than a contract between two different organisations, the council and the developer, a unilateral undertaking is often the developer saying, without the sort of agreement with the council, is just a sort of deed saying, a legal document saying, I'm committing to doing X, Y, Z. I won't get into the details of why unilateral undertakings are sometimes used, but for more simple things, for example, developers just saying, I'm committing to give you £5,000 to replace that tree. Super simple agreement. So rather than going through the whole full Section 106 agreement, and there are other instances where unilateral undertaking is used. But essentially, again, it's just a legal document that is securing those planning obligations. Okay. Right, so we talked right at the top of the call about affordable housing. So Section 106, these legal agreements. So Section 106, planning obligations, they're the major way in which we secure affordable housing in this country. So affordable housing is primarily delivered through us in planning, through this mechanism, through the developers, including affordable housing, and through councils securing through that affordable housing through their policies, and then the individual discussions with developers on specific schemes. And again, you'll get these slides, but you can see a huge amount of that delivery comes through these agreements with private developers. So it's not all social landlords, registered providers like housing associations. So it's not all coming through sort of that route or councils building. It's actually developers, private sector developers providing an element of their development as affordable housing. So it's a primary mechanism at this point in time through which we're securing affordable housing. So this process we've described is a hugely important one in the context of planning, but also just in the context of us as people living in the UK, of course. So the mechanics of this has a really important impact. Because of this, it's really important to continue to monitor those agreements and to make sure that they are followed through. And you'll often have a Section 106 monitoring officer or an officer who has special responsibility for monitoring Section 106. Has anyone come across or met such an officer in the council? Yeah. Not yet. Okay, well, there'll normally be someone, either a specific officer or an officer perhaps in your development management team or your planning policy team within a council, who have specific responsibilities for monitoring these agreements. And this means looking through that contract and saying, okay, what have we asked for and when do they need to do it? So when do they need to pay it or provide it as a developer, and just making sure that they follow through. And if there isn't follow through, what you can do is enforce, because it's a legal agreement, it's a contract, it's binding, right? So you can enforce that agreement legally if a developer doesn't comply. So first you're monitoring it to make sure it does happen, and by and large it does happen. People will provide the affordable housing, etc., but making sure it's delivered at the right time, etc. That's why you want to monitor it and just follow through there. But you can also have different routes to enforcement action, and that can be anything from going to court to going on site and just sort of saying, no, you're not, you have to stop development. Now, an important thing to remember about Section 106 and this legal contract is it's not a contract between the council and an individual, although it is in a sense, it's between the developer and that council. But if that developer sells the land, the obligations run with the land. What do I mean by that? So if someone got a planning permission, they've got Section 106 legal agreement, if they sold the land before they started to build, those obligations sit with the land. So the new developer would have to deliver the amount of affordable housing you secured and make those payments. Or if I mentioned earlier that you might say a development is car free, so you can't have a parking permit for the street because we want car free development. In this case, even after the development is completed, that obligation that it is car free sits with the land. It doesn't go away with the developer, it sits with the land. That means future residents, unless that agreement is changed, can't have a parking permit in that instance. Yep, so that's an important thing to bear in mind with Section 106. It's an obligation that runs with the land, it's applied to the land itself rather than the individual. Okay, question for you, and this is actually a bit of a silly question. It's your birthday. The last time I did this, it was actually someone's birthday. I'm assuming that's not the case, and everyone's not in planning training for their birthday. But it's your birthday. Would you rather have 50% voucher for Marks and Spencers or 30 quid cash? Voucher or cash? Answers in the chat. Oh, got a bit of a mix here, liking that. probably cash. Sitting on the fence there. M&S, you got to love M&S. Who doesn't love M&S? I'm a bit of an M&S fan as well. Right, I asked this question. It's not completely random, although I have been known for random unrelated questions in the middle of the presentation, just to check everyone's still with us. But I'm asking this question because there are two different types of developer contributions I'm going to talk about today. We've talked about one, which is Section 106, and I'm going to talk to you now about Community Infrastructure Levy. But if we're looking at Section 106, what Section 106 does is in that agreement, I might say we're going to have £30,000 for open space, provision associated with that development, and we're going to take it from that development. I'm going to spend it specifically in that project, and that's your equivalent of an M&S voucher. So you're securing from that development a specific sum of money to spend on a specific thing. So you're limited through that legal agreement because you said what you'll spend it on. So that means for me as a council, I need to spend it on open space. I can't take my M&S voucher into, I don't know, where would I go? Struggling. Where would I take my M&S voucher? I can't take my M&S voucher into John Lewis and try and use it in John Lewis. I can't take my M&S voucher into a music store and say, I'd like to buy some records with my M&S voucher. They'll be like, that's nice, but no, because that's not the deal. And with Section 106, what we're doing is securing in relation to a specific development, a specific sum of money. But it's a different type of developer contribution, which is much more like getting a cash pot. And so sometimes you might be getting a little bit less, but you've got a lot more freedom, and it's also more predictable in the context of SIL about how you can spend it. So you're getting a pot of money. So if you're an authority, so has anyone heard of Community Infrastructure Levy or SIL? Yeah. So most, not all, but most authorities, yeah, will charge a community infrastructure levy. So that's in addition to Section 106. There's a set charge for all new development above certain, quite small scale. So if you're charging a SIL, so if you're more than one home, or if you're more than 100 square meters of other, like maybe commercial space, there's a charge per square meter that you have to pay to the council. And unlike the kind of voucher style Section 106 for a specific thing, it's a pot of money that I can spend on infrastructure across my area or to support the development in my area. Maybe I want to pay for something just over the border. There might be a new, I don't know, a new leisure centre that my residents are going to use. And so what SIL does is it sets a set charge, and we take it as a single pot of money. Now, the way we set a SIL rate, and I'm going to show you an example of one, can be different by the geography of that area or the land use and the scale. Now, and unlike Section 106, SIL you don't get to, it's not a discussion, negotiation where there's a bit of to and fro, you just pay it. It's a bit more like something like council tax. That's the charge. You calculate it, you pay it. There are some discounts available. So if you're an affordable housing type development, or you've got some affordable housing, that floor space gets deducted off. Also, certain charitable developments don't have to pay either. So, charged on all development, and it can be spent by the council much more widely on infrastructure to support growth. And as I said, anywhere inside or even outside of the authority, providing it's serving that development within the authority. Now, and I get to choose as a local authority now how I spend my pot. So I've got my 30 quid cash rather than my £50 M&S voucher. But there are some rules that local neighbourhoods get to have a slice of that. So it's either 15% up to a certain, there's a little formula based on the number of residents within an area. So there's a cap, or 25% with no cap to neighbourhoods who've got a neighbourhood plan. You can also take some of that SIL money, 5%, to spend it on administration. That's the cost of actually collecting the SIL. So if you are charging a SIL, again, you might have a SIL officer or an officer who's responsible for collecting that SIL, and usually you use that admin fee for their wages and for like the software they use and that kind of thing. So the community infrastructure levy is what sets out how you set that SIL charge, but also sets out how you calculate SIL, and it really is that everything. It is like the proper law and process end to end on how you use SIL. I also mentioned that there were kind of those rules about the way you use Section 106, so the different type of development contribution. We've got SIL and Section 106. For Section 106, those rules, like it's necessary, reasonably related to development, those rules are also within this bit of the legislation in the Community Infrastructure Levy regulations. It's number 122 if you want to look that up. Who liked maths at school? Maths fans? Yay. 1. Okay, in the minority there, Ella. So this calculation probably looked quite simple to you. It's quite a basic formula, and this calculation of how you calculate SIL is actually set out in the Community Infrastructure Levy regulations. And what it's saying is the SIL that you charge is the rate that the SIL was set at by the area of the development, the number of square meters of the development. You're multiplying it and you're timesing it by an index, which is like come across a retail price index or anything like that. It's like a way of measuring inflation, but an index at a point in time at the planning permission against an index when the charge was set already. And what that is to do with is if inflation and the cost of building things go up, it's just capturing that increase in the charge itself. So this is the formula that's given in the in the Community Infrastructure Levy regulations for how you calculate SIL. So it's very prescriptive. It's not as loose as Section 106, where it's a little bit more negotiated and bespoke. It's very much a set, sort of almost tax-like, really, as I said. Now here's an example just to bring this to life a bit more. This is City of Westminster. Have most of you been to the Local Government Association building in Westminster? No? Okay. Yes, so one of you has. So I think we're somewhere in Westminster. So the Pathways programme is run out of an office that is based in Westminster, right in central London, where Westminster is where Parliament is. Buckingham Palace is in this location as well. And so this is their SIL charge. And what you can see here is they've, as I mentioned before, you can set a different charge for different areas and for different uses. And so they've got within different prime is this area here. And they've called this red area core and this blue area here fringe. And they're saying, okay, within the prime area for residential uses, so if you're building houses, homes, flats, in this prime residential area, it's £550 per square metre. It's quite hefty, but this is one of the most expensive places in the country. So SIL rates, sort of as we go further north, will be much lower than this. And so for commercial uses, as you can see here, and it's telling us this is offices, hotels, and nightclubs and casinos. It's saying in this prime area it's 200, core 150, fringe 50, and all other uses are saying actually you don't have to pay. So if you're doing something like building a community centre or something that's not a commercial or residential use, you don't have to pay. Now, why do you think there are different charges set in different areas? Good question, Rocciano. I'm going to come back to that. Why might there be different charges set in different areas? Any thoughts? You can unmic or use the chat. So, wow, totally on it today, more than I am. Though you've just given the 2 reasons, Ella and Simon. So first of all, let's deal with Ella's comment. So this is more use of infrastructure in certain areas. So the way SIL works is that you have to calculate to set the charge in the first place. You have to demonstrate that you need to set a charge, that you have to have infrastructure to pay. So you don't really look at it on an area basis, but Ella, you certainly calculate, do we actually have infrastructure to deliver in this location, and how much will it cost? And you have to take that cost to an examination where you set your CIL charge, and what you do is you put a whole list of the different, and we need a school in this area, we need this kind of hospital expansion, we need this sort of road improvement, park, etc., etc. And then you put the costs against it, and that's one of the justifications for your CIL. And then you've gone to land cost, and we're coming back to this idea of viability. So different areas have different levels of viability. That means how profitable is it going to be to develop in that area? And what we can see here is if you're right in the middle of Westminster, so if you're right snap bang next to Regent's Park, Hyde Park, you're in the, you know, the areas of the country with some of the highest values, both of land, but also for sales, like you can sell your development for a lot, then you're getting charged more. As you go north into Westminster, and you can see, and you're getting up to nearer Brent and areas which have lower development values, when these areas you've got a lower charge. And so it's a combination of the two to set my charge. It's viability, how viable is it? And that's what sets the charge. But to get the charge in the first place, and because it goes through with something like an examination by an independent person, as a council, I have to also demonstrate that what the cost of the infrastructure is as well overall. But back to CIL, once I've got that money in, and I'm going to talk about how we get that money in just briefly. But actually, before I move on to that, great question from Rocchiano there. Are there charges for different heights of the building? In this charging schedule, as you can see, there isn't a scale charge, but yes, you can set a different charge for the scale of the building. And again, that goes back to how viable it is, whether you've got more value in taller or less value in taller buildings, actually, sometimes, or not. And so you can set it again based on that viability. That's the profitability, actually, if you like, of the development. Okay. So how do I get this money in? Well, it's a bit of to and fro with the developers, very structured process. The developer has to fill in certain forms at certain points in time, and then the person who's dealing with CIL in the council will be looking at those forms, making sure that they're filled in correctly, checking some of the maths in it, and doing all of those kinds of things. And if you want to have a look at those forms, you just Google CIL forms, and they're on Planning Portal, just to get a sense of what they look like. And so, as I say, like it's a bit of to and fro. The developer submits a form, whereas the council saying, okay, thank you very much, that looks all right. Well, no, it doesn't. Would you go and fill it in again? And there's a whole process that you go through before you get to the kind of pay point. So developer has to tell you, right, we're starting, or developer, and we have to, as a council, say, right, well, this is how much it's gonna cost before you start. And then they tell us when they start, and they say, here's the actual bill. And then they pay based on whatever payment phasing that there might be. And that, as I say, that pot of money, that CIL money, it's like my 30 quid cash. It's not my M&S voucher. As a council, I get to hold that. And my rules are I have to give a certain amount, a proportion of it, to kind of more neighbourhood priorities. And I work with my neighbourhoods, or if there's a parish council, I'll give that money over to the parish council to spend that 15 or 25% if there's a neighbourhood plan. And then I also, if there is I can take a little bit for the admin for this cost of this process to my council. But the main part, the largest sum, I get to decide what infrastructure, and it has to be infrastructure, but I get to decide what I spend it on. I don't have to spend it on a set piece of open space linked to a development. I can spend it anywhere in my authority, provided it's an infrastructure to support that development, the overall development in my authority area. No good presentation on developer contributions does not have a picture of a piece of cake in it when talking about viability. So when we're talking about viability, we're talking about the total value of a development, and that's often represented as a cake, because you're slicing up that cake to pay for different things, aren't you? And there's only so much cake, there's only so much value in a development. So viability is a really important central concept for planning. When we set out requirements in plans, so when we looked right at the beginning of this session at affordable housing requirements, we have to test before we set those requirements that they are viable. That means, can development in that area, can you still develop in that area? Is it going to make it too expensive, essentially, to develop? We talked about this session being all about money, and this is very much what it comes down to. So is there enough value? Is that cake big enough to pay for the amount of affordable housing that we want? And so what we're doing through this viability process is we're saying there's a total scheme value, isn't there? So if I'm looking at, and I'm going to give credit, I think it's fallen off the slide here, but this is from a company called BNP Paribas, who work a lot on viability assessments, and I've taken this from one of their reports. Now, if I'm developing a residential scheme, let's say I've got this scheme here is £100 million scheme, so it's an expensive, fairly large scheme in London and fairly central area. And the scheme's got certain value, so I know I can sell my private housing for so much, even my affordable housing. Some of it is kind of some for sale product type elements, and say, well, I won't get the same amount of return, but there is some still level of return on it. And so that's my total value, development value, the total pie, if you like, the cake. And then this cake gets sliced up into costs, doesn't it? And so there's going to be a whole load of costs associated with the actual build of this development. I also need to get a profit, because why would I bother? And actually planning policy, national planning policy says actually you've got to allow for this profit, otherwise development's not going to come forward. That's a system in which we have. There are also a whole bunch of fees associated with development. There'll be kind of at the end stage of development, marketing fees and all of that kind of thing, but there'll be planning fees to submit the application in the first place for developers and other professional fees. There might also be interest. I might be borrowing money. There'll also be planning obligations and CIL. So the authority has some expectations in terms of affordable housing ask, in terms of community infrastructure payments that I need to make. And then I would have also had to pay what's left, if you like, the residual land value. I didn't just get the land, I've had to pay for it. And even if I did just get the land, the way viability works is it makes an assumption about that residual value of the land after all of these costs are gone, and we check to make sure that this is a sensible amount. We can benchmark that against other costs. Don't worry too much about the detail. I'll put a link in there if you want to explore this in more detail. But back to the pie or the cake example, we're basically saying with viability is any development has a certain amount of value in it, right? And there are certain types of costs that have to come out of it. Now, if these costs are higher than that value, if the slices of the cake that we want are bigger than the cake itself, that development is unviable. Does that make sense? Not quite. Kind of. Okay. So if I've got a development that I know I can sell for £100 million, if the different costs, if I add up all these different costs, including what I'm asking for planning obligations and CIL, and it's more than £100 million, that development is not viable. That development can't come forward, and we assess it as not being viable. It's not reasonable, and something has to give. And so I'd have to say, well, I might have to reduce, for example, the amount of planning obligations that I'm asking for. I might have to accept in an individual case that this development is not going to come forward. So there's a set amount of cake, that's the development value. And as you slice it up, you can only have the amount of the cake in terms of the cost. And that's where we talk about a viability assessment, and that's what that's doing. It's assessing all of these different costs and saying, is there enough value in a development to pay for all of those different costs? Oh, that is such a good question. So good question in the chat, as you can see from Simon. If there is little to no profit, would it still be viable? Yes and no. So there's a kind of assumption used around sort of a 20% being kind of what's profit, what's acceptable as a kind of profit level. But there's some instances where you might have less than that, but a development still might come forward. And one example of that is where you've got a very long build-out program for a development, maybe a very large development, and the actual money doesn't start to come in until quite far down the line. in the development. So in that case, even though the profit is low at the beginning, over time it starts to have that return. It still might come forward, it still might be developed, even though technically we're kind of saying it's not viable. We can also, as a council, we might decide that we have to take into account viability, certainly, but there might be some instances where we look at this and we look at the costs and we say, actually, we're not compromising on the amount of affordable things that we're asking for. We think this is particularly unique to this development, and we'd rather say no to this development and wait till something comes along that can afford it, or the market improve. You can say no, but ultimately, going back to Jim was saying, a lot of affordable housing comes from private development functionally in the country. That's a kind of real difficult judgment that you're sometimes making around, do you allow this to come forward, because it still might deliver something, and we still need homes, for example. So those are the kind of real kind of critical issues that our colleagues in our respective departments are dealing with, who are particularly dealing with those larger planning applications. Oh, right. So going back, I talked about the idea that you can reduce the ask, and the implications are, do you say no? Do you say no, or do you say yes, but we're going to have some negotiation over reducing those asks? And remember, SIL isn't negotiable, so SIL just has to get paid anyway. So normally the more substantial cost is affordable housing. So oftentimes the discussion is around how much affordable housing will be produced, will be delivered on a site when you're getting into those viability type discussions. So we've talked today about Section 106 or S106, just to get all the acronyms out now, and the Community Infrastructure Levy. One is much more specific to a development, so I'm taking that money from a specific development. I've got a contract and I take money to pay for a specific thing. I take £30,000 to pay for an open space. SIL is a set charge across all types of quite small scale development sometimes, and I'm saying, okay, you just pay the amount per square metre, and I put it into a pot. I give some of that pot to neighbourhoods, but I can use that whole pot to spend on schools or other things that are supporting the development within my area. So affordable housing continues to be secured through Section 106, but you can also get some types of very site-specific, individual development-specific infrastructure costs from those. SIL is very much a general charge, and it's not site specific. It's a kind of area wide charge, and I'm taking that money to pay for infrastructure, and I don't use it for affordable housing because affordable housing is under Section 106 here. So both I can secure money from planning permissions, but in slightly different ways, using different mechanisms to pay for supporting infrastructure and affordable housing in the case of Section 106. I think that brings us to the end of the presentation. I've been talking for just over an hour. I think my voice is about to go. If you want, I can stop recording so you can camera on and answer questions. Would that be a good idea? Yeah, I'll stop recording now anyway. So we can. Let me just work out how to do that.